The mountains in the winter of 1949 held a particular kind of silence. It wasn't the peaceful quiet that city folks might imagine when they picture rural life. It was something heavier, more complete. The kind of silence where sounds carried for miles across frozen valleys, where a cracking branch or a distant gunshot echoed through the hollows like a warning. The mountains themselves seemed to press down on the scattered communities that clung to their slopes, small clusters of humanity separated by miles of dense forest and rough terrain. In those days, they were a world apart from the rest of America. While cities were beginning to recover from the war years, enjoying new prosperity and modern conveniences, much of this region remained locked in an older time. Many families lived without electricity or running water. They heated their homes with wood stoves and walked dirt paths that turned to thick mud with every rain. The isolation wasn't just physical, it was cultural, generational. People here solved their own problems, kept their own counsel, and rarely looked to outsiders for help. The cabin sat roughly 12 miles outside the nearest town, accessible only by a logging road that became impassable during heavy weather. It was a simple structure, built decades earlier from local timber that had weathered to a dull gray. The roof sagged slightly in the middle, and the chimney leaned at an angle that suggested it might not survive another harsh winter. A narrow porch ran along the front, its boards warped and uneven. Behind the cabin, the forest pressed close, a wall of bare trees and tangled undergrowth that seemed ready to reclaim the small clearing at any moment. No one passing by would have given the place much thought. It looked like hundreds of other homesteads scattered throughout the mountains, places where families scraped by on whatever they could grow, hunt, or trade. The kind of dwelling that spoke of hard lives and harder choices. But in January of 1949, this particular cabin would become the center of something that would shake the county to its core. The family living there consisted of 4 people. The father was a man in his late 40s, though he looked older. Years of manual labor and irregular meals had carved deep lines into his face and bent his shoulders forward. He worked when he could find it, doing odd jobs for neighboring farms, cutting timber, and repairing fences. His wife was a worn-down woman who had once been pretty, before poverty and childbearing had aged her beyond her years. They had 2 children still at home, a daughter of 16 and a son of 14. There had been other children, but they had either died young or left as soon as they were able. The father ruled his household with the kind of authority that went unquestioned in many rural homes of that era. His word was law, his temper was unpredictable, and his family had learned to read his moods the way sailors read the sky for signs of storms. When he was sober, which wasn't often, he could be almost pleasant. He would sit by the fire and tell stories about his younger days, back when he'd had plans and ambitions. But alcohol changed him into something else entirely, something mean and dangerous. Money was always scarce. The family survived on what they could grow in their small garden during the summer months, supplemented by whatever game the father could shoot or trap. The children went to school irregularly, when the weather allowed and when their help wasn't needed at home. The daughter had a quick mind and had once dreamed of becoming a teacher, but those dreams had faded as she'd grown older and realized the limitations of her circumstances. The son was quieter, more withdrawn, spending much of his time in the woods with a rifle that was nearly as tall as he was. Neighbors were few and far between. The nearest family lived almost 3 miles away, an elderly couple who kept mostly to themselves. Occasionally, someone would stop by the cabin, usually a traveling salesman or a hunter who had wandered too far from familiar territory. These visits were brief and uncomfortable. The father didn't like outsiders, didn't trust them. He would stand on the porch with his arms crossed, making it clear that visitors weren't welcome to linger. The winter of 1949 came early and stayed late. By January, the mountains were locked in a deep freeze that made survival even more difficult than usual. Firewood had to be gathered constantly. Water had to be carried from a spring that was threatening to freeze solid. The family's food supplies were running low, and there was no money to buy more. Tension in the household had been building for weeks, a pressure that seemed to increase with every frozen dawn. The daughter had changed recently. Something in her eyes had hardened. She no longer looked away when her father spoke to her. She had started to challenge him in small ways, refusing to jump at his every command, taking her time to respond when he called for her. This shift in behavior hadn't gone unnoticed. Her mother watched with worried eyes, knowing that defiance came with consequences in this house. The son had noticed it too. He'd seen the way his sister looked at their father now, with something that might have been hatred or might have been fear or might have been both. He'd heard the arguments that happened when he was supposed to be asleep, the raised voices that cut through the thin walls of the cabin. Something was building toward a breaking point. He could feel it the way animals sense an approaching storm. On the morning of January 18th, the sun rose over a landscape that looked carved from ice. The trees were coated in frost that glittered in the weak light. Smoke rose from the cabin's crooked chimney, a thin gray line against the pale sky. From the outside, everything appeared normal. Just another day in just another struggling household But inside that cabin, forces were already in motion that would transform it from an anonymous dwelling into something else entirely. A place that would be remembered. A place that would be spoken about in whispers for generations. A place where the fragile structures that held a family together were about to collapse completely, revealing the darkness that had been festering beneath the surface all along. The arguments had started small. A misplaced tool, a meal that wasn't ready on time, a chore left undone. But by mid-January, the fights had grown louder and more frequent. The father's drinking had gotten worse as the winter dragged on, and with it, his temper had shortened to nearly nothing. He would erupt over the smallest things, his face turning red as he shouted accusations and threats. The mother would try to smooth things over, her voice quiet and pleading, but her attempts at peacekeeping only seemed to make him angrier. The daughter, whose name was Sarah, had reached a point where she simply couldn't pretend anymore. For years, she had kept her head down, had done what was expected, had swallowed her anger and her shame. But something had shifted inside her. Maybe it was because she was getting older and could see more clearly what her life would become if nothing changed. Maybe it was because she had started to understand that the way her father treated them wasn't normal, wasn't right, no matter how many other families in the mountains lived the same way. She had started talking back, not loudly or dramatically, but in a way that was somehow more insulting. When her father ordered her to do something, she would pause before responding, letting the silence stretch out just long enough to make it clear she was choosing to obey rather than simply accepting his authority. She would look at him directly when she spoke, not with the downcast eyes of a proper daughter. These small rebellions drove him into fits of rage. "You think you're better than this family?" he had shouted at her just 3 days before. "You think you're too good to do what you're told?" Sarah had stood in the doorway of the cabin, a bucket of water in her hands, and had met his eyes without flinching. "I think I'm tired," she had said simply. "I'm just tired." The slap had come so fast she barely saw it coming. The bucket had fallen from her hands, water spilling across the rough wooden floor. Her mother had gasped and rushed forward, but Sarah had waved her away. She had touched her reddening cheek and had looked at her father with an expression that was impossible to read. Then she had picked up the bucket and walked back outside to refill it from the spring. The son, whose name was Thomas, had watched this exchange from the corner where he'd been cleaning his rifle. He'd seen the look on his sister's face afterward, and it had frightened him more than his father's violence. There was something cold in her expression, something calculating. She wasn't crying or scared. She was thinking, planning. Thomas himself had his own reasons for wanting to be away from the cabin as much as possible. His father had started making demands that went beyond normal chores. He wanted Thomas to help him with things that felt wrong, like poaching deer out of season on land they didn't own, or stealing tools from a neighboring farm. Thomas had done these things because refusing his father was impossible, but each time he felt a little piece of himself die. He had started spending more time in the woods, even in the bitter cold, just to be away from the cabin and the constant tension that lived inside it. The family's financial situation had grown desperate. The father had been fired from his last job after showing up drunk, and no one in the area would hire him now. They were living on the dried beans and cornmeal that remained from the previous year's harvest, supplemented by whatever small game Thomas could shoot. The mother had tried to sell some quilts she'd made, walking the 6 miles to town in the snow, only to be offered prices so low that it wouldn't have covered the cost of the fabric. The cold had made everything worse. They were burning through firewood faster than Thomas could cut it, and the father refused to help, spending most of his time sitting by the stove with whatever liquor he'd managed to acquire through methods no one asked about. The cabin was never truly warm. At night, frost formed on the inside of the windows, and they could see their breath in the air. They slept in their clothes, huddled under every blanket they owned. Sarah had been making trips to town more often lately, which was unusual. She would leave early in the morning and not return until late afternoon. When her mother asked what she was doing, Sarah would give vague answers about looking for work or running errands. But there was something secretive in the way she acted when she returned, something that suggested she was doing more than just looking for jobs that didn't exist. The truth was that Sarah had been talking to people, not about her family specifically, but asking questions about what options a young woman might have. Could she work as a live-in maid for a wealthy family in a larger town? Could she get on a bus and go somewhere else entirely? Every answer she received made it clear that escaping required money she didn't have and references she couldn't provide. She was trapped, and the realization of this made her increasingly reckless. On January 15th, something had happened that pushed the situation even closer to the edge. The father had received word that a cousin of his had died and left him a small sum of money, maybe $50. It wasn't a fortune, but for a family living as they were, it represented possibility. The mother had immediately begun making plans for how they could use it, pay off debts at the general store, buy flour and sugar, get Thomas some boots that actually fit. But the father had other ideas. He'd taken the money and disappeared for 2 days, returning drunk and empty-handed except for a half-empty bottle of whiskey. He'd spent it all, every cent, on alcohol and whatever else had caught his fancy during his binge. When the mother had started crying, asking him how he could do such a thing, he had turned violent. He'd thrown things, breaking their only lamp and putting his fist through the wall near the stove. Sarah had stepped between them. It was the first time she'd ever physically intervened, and everyone in the cabin had frozen. "Don't," she'd said to her father, her voice shaking but firm. "Don't touch her again." For a long moment, the father had stared at his daughter. Thomas had tightened his grip on the rifle that was never far from his hands. The mother had held her breath. Then the father had laughed, a mean, bitter sound. "You threatening me, girl, in my own house?" "I'm asking you to stop," Sarah had said. "That's all, just stop." The father had shoved past her and out the door, disappearing into the cold afternoon. He hadn't come back until the next morning, and when he did, he'd been in an even fouler mood. Something had changed, though. There was a new wariness in the way he looked at Sarah, and a new calculation in the way she looked back at him. Thomas had his own breaking point approaching. His father had been pressuring him to do something that went beyond petty theft. There was a man in town who had money, the father had explained, and that man kept it in his house because he didn't trust banks. Thomas knew what his father was suggesting, even if the words were never spoken plainly. He wanted Thomas to help him rob this man, maybe hurt him if necessary. The idea made Thomas sick. He was only 14, still a boy in many ways, but he understood that there were lines that, once crossed, changed a person forever. He'd been having nightmares about it, waking up in the dark cabin with his heart racing and his hands shaking. He tried to talk to Sarah about it, but she'd been distracted, caught up in her own problems. The mother had grown increasingly quiet as the tensions escalated. She'd learned long ago that speaking up only made things worse, but she watched everything with worried eyes. She saw the way her daughter had changed, the way her son was withdrawing into himself. She saw her husband becoming more erratic and more dangerous, and she felt completely powerless to stop whatever was coming. There were other pressures too, things the family didn't talk about but that hung over them like a dark cloud. Rumors in the community about the father's behavior, whispers that had reached the mother's ears when she'd gone to town. People are saying he'd been seen with money he shouldn't have, suggesting he might be stealing more than just tools. There was talk about the way he treated his family, concerns that someone should check on them. But in those days, in that place, people minded their own business. What happened inside a man's home was his affair, no matter how wrong it might be. Sarah had found something during one of her explorations of the cabin, something hidden in the rafters wrapped in oilcloth. It was a gun, a pistol that she'd never seen before, not the hunting rifles that hung openly on the wall, but something smaller and more concealable. She didn't know where her father had gotten it or what he planned to use it for, but its presence frightened her in a way that was hard to explain. It suggested planning, intent. The possibility of violence that went beyond a slap or a shove. She'd put it back where she'd found it, but the knowledge of its existence had changed something in her mind. She'd started thinking about it at night when she couldn't sleep, started wondering if it was loaded, started imagining scenarios that both terrified and fascinated her. Thomas had noticed that his sister was carrying a knife now, a small folding blade that she kept in her pocket. When he'd asked her about it, she'd shrugged. "For protection," she'd said, "in case I run into something in the woods." But they both knew she rarely went into the woods alone anymore. The knife wasn't for animals. On January 17th, the day before everything would change, there had been a final confrontation. The father had come home in the afternoon, drunk again, and had announced that he'd made a decision. Sarah was going to marry a man from the next county over, someone the father had apparently been talking to. The man was nearly 40 years old, a widower with children of his own. The father would receive a payment for arranging the marriage. Sarah had stared at him in disbelief. "I'm not marrying anyone," she'd said. "You'll do what you're told," her father had replied. "You're old enough and we need the money, it's already settled." The argument that followed had been the worst yet. Sarah had screamed at him, calling him things that made the mother gasp and cover her mouth. She told him she would rather die than marry some stranger, that he had no right to sell her like livestock. The father had tried to grab her, but she dodged away, quick and agile. Thomas had stood up, rifle in hand, not pointing it at anyone but making his presence known. The father had looked at his son, then back at his daughter, and something like fear had crossed his face. Just for a moment, but it was there. He was losing control of his family, and he knew it. "We'll talk about this tomorrow," he'd finally said, "when everyone's calmer." But no one believed him. They all knew that tomorrow wouldn't bring calm. Tomorrow would bring a decision point, a moment when the pressure that had been building for weeks, months, maybe years, would finally have to release somehow. That night, no one slept well. The cabin was filled with the sound of shifting bodies and restless breathing. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and making the trees creak and groan. The temperature dropped even further, and the fire in the stove burned low despite Thomas getting up twice to feed it more wood. In the darkness, 3 people lay awake thinking about the same things. Escape, freedom, and what terrible price might have to be paid to achieve either one. The morning of January 18th began like any other frozen dawn in the sun rose pale and distant, offering light but no warmth. Inside the cabin, the family moved through their routines with mechanical precision, each person lost in their own thoughts, avoiding eye contact, speaking only when necessary. The air itself felt heavy, thick with unspoken things. The father was the last to wake, emerging from the small room he shared with his wife around mid-morning. His eyes were bloodshot, his hands shaking slightly as he demanded coffee that wasn't there because they'd run out days ago. This immediately put him in a foul mood. He sat by the stove in his undershirt despite the cold, watching Sarah as she moved around the cabin, sweeping the floor with short, angry strokes. "That man's coming by this afternoon," he said suddenly, his voice rough from sleep and alcohol. "The one I told you about. He wants to meet you properly before we make the final arrangements." Sarah stopped sweeping. She stood perfectly still, her back to her father, the broom handle gripped so tightly her knuckles had gone white. "I already told you no," she said quietly. "And I already told you it ain't your choice to make." The father's voice was rising now, the familiar pattern beginning. "You're 16 years old, you do what I say, that's how it works." Thomas was outside splitting wood, but he could hear the voices carrying through the thin walls. He paused mid-swing, the axe held above his head, listening. His mother was in the cabin too, somewhere in the background, silent as always. "I won't do it." Sarah turned around now, facing her father directly. "You can't make me." The father stood up, and even from outside, Thomas could sense the energy shift. He lowered the axe and moved toward the cabin door. "Can't make you?" The father's laugh was ugly. "You think you've got any say in this? You think you're gonna just run off and make your own way? With what? You got nothing. You are nothing without this family, without me." "Then I'll be nothing somewhere else." Sarah's voice was steady, but there was something underneath it, something sharp and dangerous. "I'll walk out that door right now and never come back." "Like hell you will." The father moved toward her fast, faster than a man his age and condition should have been able to move. He grabbed her arm, his fingers digging in hard enough to bruise. Sarah tried to pull away, but his grip was iron. Thomas burst through the door just as his father raised his other hand. "Don't," Thomas shouted, and something in his voice made the father pause. The boy was holding the axe, not threateningly, but the presence of it changed the dynamic in the room. "Put that down and get out," the father said. "This is between me and her." "Let her go," Thomas said. His voice was shaking, but he didn't move. For a moment, nobody breathed. The mother stood frozen by the stove, her hands clutched to her chest. Sarah was still in her father's grip, but her eyes had moved to the rafters, to the place where she knew the hidden pistol lay wrapped in oilcloth. The father must have seen something in her expression because he suddenly shoved her away, hard enough that she stumbled and caught herself against the table. "Fine," he spat. "Fine, but when he gets here this afternoon, you're gonna be respectful. You're gonna smile and nod and do what you're told. And if you embarrass me, if you make me look like I can't control my own family, you'll regret it. All of you will regret it." He grabbed his coat from where it hung by the door and stormed out, presumably heading to wherever he went when he needed to drink away his anger. Thomas and Sarah watched him go, neither of them speaking until his footsteps had faded into the distance. "He means it," the mother said softly. It was the first time she'd spoken all morning. "He'll hurt us if you defy him when that man comes." Sarah touched her arm where her father had grabbed her. "I know," she said. "I know he will." The next few hours passed in a strange, suspended way. Thomas went back to chopping wood, but his mind wasn't on the task. He kept thinking about the look on his father's face, the barely controlled violence. He kept thinking about what would happen when the stranger arrived, what his father might do if Sarah refused again. Sarah spent the time moving through the cabin like she was looking for something. She cleaned things that were already clean, rearranged items on the shelf, and climbed up to check something in the rafters. When she came back down, her face was set in an expression Thomas had never seen before. It was beyond fear, beyond anger. It was a decision. The father returned around noon, drunker than he'd been when he left. He was carrying a bottle that was already half empty, and he settled back into his chair by the stove without speaking to anyone. He drank steadily, his eyes following Sarah whenever she moved, making sure she wasn't planning to run. Around 2 in the afternoon, they heard the sound of a horse and wagon approaching. The stranger had arrived early. The father stood up, straightening his shirt, trying to look more sober than he was. "Sarah," he said, "come here, fix your hair." Sarah didn't move. She was standing near the table, her hand in her pocket where the small folding knife rested. "No," she said simply. The father's face went dark red. "What did you say?" "I said no. I'm not meeting him. I'm not marrying him. I'm not doing any of it." The sound of footsteps on the porch interrupted whatever the father had been about to say. He pointed at Sarah, his finger shaking with rage. "We'll deal with this after," he hissed, then turned to open the door. But Sarah had already moved. In the confusion of the moment, with her father's attention divided, she climbed quickly onto a chair and reached into the rafters. Her hands found the oilcloth package, found the cold metal of the pistol inside. She unwrapped it as she climbed down, her fingers working automatically, muscle memory from watching her father clean his rifles dozens of times. The door opened. The stranger stepped inside, a tall man with gray in his beard and eyes that looked Sarah up and down in a way that made her skin crawl. The father was greeting him, shaking his hand, starting to make excuses for the condition of the cabin. Thomas saw his sister first, saw the gun in her hand, her arm raising, her finger finding the trigger. "Sarah, no," he shouted, but the words were drowned out by the explosive crack of the pistol firing in the enclosed space. The sound was enormous, impossibly loud. It seemed to fill the entire world. The stranger stumbled backward, confusion on his face, a red stain spreading across his chest. He hit the doorframe and slid down it, his mouth opening and closing like he was trying to speak but couldn't find the air. The father spun around, his face a mask of shock and horror. He looked at the stranger, then at his daughter, then at the gun in her hand. "What have you done?" he whispered. "Jesus Christ, what have you done?" Sarah was staring at the pistol like she didn't recognize it, like it had appeared in her hand by magic. Her face had gone completely white. The gun was shaking violently, and for a moment, Thomas thought she might drop it. Then her father took a step toward her, his hands outstretched, and she raised the pistol again. "Stay back," she said. Her voice didn't sound like her own. It was high and thin, barely more than a whisper. "Sarah, put the gun down." The father was speaking slowly, carefully, like he was talking to a wild animal. "Just put it down and we can figure this out." "Figure it out?" Sarah's laugh was hysterical. "I just killed a man. I just shot him right in front of everyone. How do we figure that out?" The stranger was making gurgling sounds now, his hands clutching at his chest. The mother had started crying, quiet sobs that she tried to muffle with her hands. Thomas stood frozen, the axe still in his grip, unable to process what he was seeing. "We can say it was an accident," the father said. "We can say he came in and attacked you, that you were defending yourself. We can make this right." But Sarah was shaking her head. "No, no more lies, no more making things right. I'm done." The father lunged for the gun. It was a stupid move, desperate and panicked, and it went exactly as wrong as it could have gone. The pistol went off again, another deafening crack, and the father stumbled backward. He looked down at his stomach, at the blood that was beginning to seep through his fingers, and the expression on his face was one of complete disbelief. "You shot me," he said like he couldn't quite believe it. "You actually shot me." He collapsed to his knees, then forward onto his face. His breathing was ragged and wet-sounding. The cabin had become a nightmare scene, 2 men bleeding on the floor, the smell of gunpowder and copper filling the air. Sarah dropped the pistol. It clattered on the wooden floor, and she stood there looking at her hands like they belonged to someone else. "I didn't mean to," she said. "I didn't mean to shoot him. I just wanted him to stop. I wanted all of it to stop." Thomas finally moved. He dropped the axe and went to his sister, pulling her away from the scene, away from the bodies. The mother was still crying, her whole body shaking with sobs. The stranger had stopped making sounds. He lay in the doorway, his eyes open and empty, staring at nothing. The father was still alive, barely. He was trying to say something, his lips moving, but the words wouldn't come. Blood pooled beneath him, spreading across the floor in a dark, horrible tide. Thomas knelt beside him, not knowing what to do, helpless in the face of such massive injury. "Get help," the mother finally said, her voice cut through the chaos. "Thomas, you have to get help. Ride to town, get the sheriff." But Thomas knew it was too late for help. He could see it in his father's eyes, the light fading, could see it in the stranger's complete stillness. This wasn't something that could be fixed with a doctor or explained away with the right story. The father's hand found Thomas's arm, gripped it with surprising strength. He pulled the boy close, close enough that Thomas could feel his father's breath, could smell the alcohol and blood. "Take care of them," the father whispered. "It's on you now." Then his hand went slack and fell away. His eyes remained open, but there was nothing behind them anymore. He was gone. The cabin was silent except for the mother's crying and the sound of Sarah's ragged breathing. 2 bodies lay on the floor in spreading pools of blood. The door hung open, letting in the cold winter air. And 3 survivors stood among the carnage, realizing that their lives had just changed in ways they couldn't begin to understand, that nothing would ever be the same again, that the desperate need to escape one nightmare had created something even worse. The first person to arrive at the cabin was Old Man, the neighbor who lived 3 miles away. He'd heard the gunshots echoing across the valley and had known immediately that something was wrong. Gunfire wasn't unusual in the mountains, but these shots had been different, too close together, coming from the direction of a cabin where he knew tensions had been running high. He'd saddled his horse and made the journey as fast as the icy terrain would allow. When he reached the clearing and saw the door standing open, steam from the warm interior meeting the cold air and creating a ghostly fog, his stomach dropped. He dismounted slowly, calling out as he approached, giving whoever was inside a chance to respond. Thomas had appeared in the doorway, his face pale and streaked with tears. "Mister," he'd said, his voice hollow, "something terrible happened." What found inside the cabin would stay with him for the rest of his life. He'd seen death before, had fought in the First War, and had witnessed his share of accidents and violence, but there was something particularly awful about this scene. The confined space, the smell, the way the blood had spread across the floor, and the 3 survivors standing there like ghosts themselves, unable to quite explain what had happened. Sarah had been sitting on the floor in the corner, rocking back and forth, her arms wrapped around her knees. She wouldn't look at anyone, wouldn't speak. The mother had been trying to clean up the blood with rags, a pointless task that she'd performed with mechanical repetition, as if by cleaning she could somehow undo what had occurred. Had taken charge. He'd sent Thomas to ride to town for the sheriff, had covered the bodies with blankets, and had gently stopped the mother from her futile cleaning. He'd tried to talk to Sarah to understand what had happened, but she'd remained silent, locked somewhere inside herself. The sheriff arrived late that afternoon with 2 deputies and the town doctor, though there was nothing the doctor could do except confirm what everyone already knew. Sheriff was a heavy-set man in his 50s who'd held his position for nearly 2 decades. He'd dealt with murders before, but they were usually straightforward affairs, bar fights gone wrong, or domestic disputes that had escalated. This was different, more complicated. He'd questioned Thomas first, because the boy seemed the most capable of coherent speech. Thomas had told the story haltingly, leaving nothing out. The escalating tensions, the arranged marriage, Sarah taking the gun, the first shot that killed the stranger and the second shot that killed their father. He'd spoken in a flat, emotionless tone, like he was describing something that had happened to someone else. The mother had confirmed the basic facts, but had been unable to provide much detail. She'd been in shock, her mind unable to process what she'd witnessed. She kept saying that it had all happened so fast that she hadn't understood what was occurring until it was over. Sarah had refused to speak at all. When the sheriff tried to question her, she'd simply stared past him, her eyes focused on something no one else could see. The doctor had examined her and declared that she was in a severe state of shock, that pushing her for answers now might do permanent damage to her mind. The sheriff had made the decision to take Sarah into custody. She was clearly the one who'd pulled the trigger, and regardless of the circumstances, 2 men were dead. Thomas and his mother would be allowed to stay at the place for now until arrangements could be made. The cabin was a crime scene and would need to remain undisturbed. They'd wrapped the bodies in canvas and loaded them onto a wagon. The stranger was eventually identified as Moss, the widower from the next county. He'd had 3 children of his own who were now orphaned. The father's body would be buried in the small cemetery near the church, though there was debate about whether a man who'd met such an end deserved a Christian burial. News of what had happened spread through the community like wildfire. In a place where everyone knew everyone else's business, a double murder was unprecedented. People talked in hushed voices at the general store, in the church, anywhere they gathered. The story grew and changed with each telling, becoming more dramatic, more sensational. Some people expressed sympathy for Sarah. They'd heard rumors about how the father treated his family, had seen the bruises on the mother's arms, and had noticed how thin and worn the children always looked. There was a sense that perhaps Sarah had been driven to desperation, that she'd simply snapped under pressure that no young girl should have to bear. These people spoke of it as a tragedy, a terrible consequence of a father's cruelty. Others were less forgiving. They argued that no matter what the circumstances, murder was murder. Sarah had killed 2 men, one of whom had done nothing wrong except show up at an unfortunate time. She was dangerous, unstable. She needed to be locked away for everyone's safety. These people spoke of moral decay, of what happened when children were allowed to defy their parents, of the breakdown of proper family order. The legal proceedings were complicated by the fact that this was 1949 in rural Arkansas, where the justice system was informal and heavily influenced by personal relationships and community sentiment. The county prosecutor was a man named who'd known the dead father slightly and hadn't liked him. He was inclined toward leniency for Sarah, seeing her as a victim who'd been pushed too far. But there were pressures from other directions. Moss's family wanted justice for his death. They argued that he'd been an innocent man, that Sarah had murdered him in cold blood with no provocation. They threatened to pursue their own form of justice if the law didn't provide it. Thomas was struggling with guilt that threatened to consume him. He kept replaying the events in his mind, wondering if he could have done something different. If he'd stayed inside instead of going out to chop wood, could he have prevented it? If he'd been faster when he heard the argument starting, could he have gotten the gun away from Sarah before she fired? He couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. The image of his father's face in those final moments haunted him. The mother had retreated into a shell of numbness. She'd lost her husband, violent and cruel as he'd been, but he was still the man she'd spent more than 20 years with. Her daughter was in jail, likely facing prison or worse. Her son was traumatized, and she was left with nothing, no home, no income, no clear path forward. The family was kind, but she couldn't impose on them forever. Sarah remained largely unresponsive in the county jail. She ate when food was brought to her, slept when exhaustion her, but otherwise sat motionless on the narrow cot. The jail wasn't equipped to handle a young girl, and the sheriff's wife had taken to visiting, bringing fresh clothes and trying to get Sarah to talk. Sometimes Sarah would respond to simple questions with a nod or shake of her head, but she wouldn't speak about what had happened, wouldn't engage with the reality of her situation. A lawyer had been appointed to represent her, a young man fresh out of law school who was overwhelmed by the complexity of the case. He tried to build a defense around self-defense and temporary insanity, arguing that Sarah had been protecting herself and her family from an abusive father and an unwanted marriage. But the facts were messy. The stranger had been shot first, and he'd posed no immediate threat. The father had been shot during what might have been an attempt to disarm his daughter. It wasn't clean. The community remained divided. Church services became uncomfortable affairs where people who'd known each other for years found themselves on opposite sides of an argument about justice and mercy. Some families stopped speaking to each other over disagreements about Sarah's fate. The cabin itself stood empty, a dark presence in the mountains that people began to avoid. No one wanted to go near it, as if the violence that had occurred there had somehow infected the place. Children told stories about it being haunted, about hearing gunshots echoing from the valley on still nights. Thomas visited his sister once, escorted by the sheriff. He tried to talk to her to tell her he didn't blame her, that he understood why she'd done what she'd done. But Sarah had looked at him with empty eyes and had said nothing. He'd left feeling worse than when he'd arrived, feeling like he'd lost his entire family in one terrible afternoon. The psychological toll was evident in everyone connected to the case. The sheriff found himself drinking more than usual, troubled by the decision he had to make about how aggressively to pursue charges. The doctor who'd examined the bodies had nightmares about the scene. Even Old Man, who'd thought himself hardened by years of difficult experiences, found his hands shaking when he thought about that day. What had started as a family's private suffering had become a public spectacle, a story that would define the community for years to come. The simple narrative of right and wrong that people wanted to apply to the situation kept breaking down under the weight of complicated realities. A father who'd been abusive but was still a father. A daughter who'd been killed but had been pushed beyond endurance. A stranger who'd died simply for being in the wrong place at the wrong time. And underneath it all, the question that no one could answer satisfactorily. Could any of this have been prevented? Should someone have intervened earlier? Were there warning signs that had been ignored? The guilt spread outward like ripples in water, touching everyone who'd known the family, everyone who'd heard the arguments and chosen to look away, everyone who'd operated under the assumption that what happened inside a man's home was his own business. The aftermath of January 18, 1949, was proving to be almost as traumatic as the event itself. A slow-motion disaster that continued to unfold with no clear resolution in sight. The trial of Sarah Henderson took place in late March of 1949, nearly 2 months after the shootings. Spring had begun to touch softening the harsh landscape that had witnessed so much suffering. The courthouse in the county seat was packed beyond capacity, people standing in the aisles and crowding around the windows to catch a glimpse of the proceedings. It wasn't often that such drama came to this quiet corner of Arkansas. Sarah had finally begun to speak again in the weeks leading up to the trial. The words came slowly at first, haltingly, as if she'd forgotten how language worked. Her lawyer had worked with her carefully, preparing her to testify, though he warned her that putting her on the stand was a risk. The prosecution would try to paint her as a cold-blooded killer, someone who'd murdered 2 men without sufficient provocation. The trial lasted 3 days. The prosecutor presented a straightforward case. Sarah had taken a gun that didn't belong to her and had shot 2 men, killing them both. The first victim, Moss, had been entirely innocent, guilty of nothing except responding to an invitation. The second victim, while perhaps not a model father, had been trying to disarm his daughter when she'd shot him. These were the facts, clear and undeniable. The defense told a different story. They called neighbors who to the father's drinking and violent temper. They presented evidence of bruises on both Sarah and her mother, documented by the doctor who'd examined them after the shootings. They talked about the poverty the family had endured, the desperation that had driven the father to try to sell his daughter into what amounted to a forced marriage. They painted a picture of a young girl who'd been backed into a corner with no way out. When Sarah took the stand, the courtroom fell completely silent. She spoke quietly, often having to be asked to repeat herself. She described years of abuse, of watching her father hurt her mother, of living in constant fear. She talked about the moment she'd learned she was being sold to a stranger, the feeling of her whole future being decided without her consent. She described taking the gun, not with the intention of killing anyone, but simply to make her father stop, to make him listen. "I just wanted it to end," she said, tears streaming down her face. "I just wanted to be free. I didn't mean for anyone to die. I didn't mean for any of it to happen the way it did." The jury deliberated for 7 hours. They returned with a verdict that satisfied no one completely, but that perhaps represented the best compromise available. Sarah was found guilty of manslaughter rather than murder, a recognition that while she'd certainly killed 2 men, the circumstances had been extreme enough to reduce her culpability. She was sentenced to 10 years in the state prison for women, with the possibility of parole after 5. Some in the community felt this was too lenient. Moss's children, now being raised by relatives, felt that their father's death had been treated as less important than Sarah's suffering. They carried that bitterness with them, a wound that would never fully heal. Others felt the sentence was too harsh. A girl who'd been abused and desperate shouldn't spend the best years of her life in prison, they argued. She'd been a victim herself, pushed beyond what any person should have to endure. The sentence felt like punishing someone for trying to escape from hell. Thomas and his mother had sat in the courtroom every day of the trial, watching as their family's most private pain was exposed to public scrutiny. When the verdict was read, the mother had wept quietly. Thomas had simply sat still, his face expressionless, trying to process what this meant for his sister's future. The Henderson family, what remained of it, dispersed in the months that followed. The mother went to live with a cousin in Missouri, disappearing into anonymity, carrying her shame and grief with her. She would die 5 years later, still relatively young, worn down by experiences that had aged her beyond her years. Some said she died of a broken heart, though the official cause was listed as pneumonia. Thomas was taken in by the family, who'd grown fond of the quiet boy. He finished his schooling, worked hard on their farm, and eventually married one of their daughters. He rarely spoke about what had happened at the cabin, and when people asked, he would simply say it was in the past and should stay there. But those who knew him well could see the weight he carried, the way certain sounds or situations would cause him to go distant and unreachable for a while. Sarah served 6 years before being paroled in 1955. The young girl who'd entered prison had emerged as a woman, hardened by her experiences but not broken. She moved to a city in Texas where no one knew her story, changed her name, and tried to build a life from scratch. She worked as a seamstress, lived alone, and never married. She sent letters to Thomas occasionally, brief notes that never mentioned the past, just asked about his life and told him small details about hers. He kept these letters in a box but rarely responded. The cabin where it had all happened was never occupied again. The county eventually claimed it for unpaid taxes, but no one wanted to buy the property. It slowly fell into ruin, the roof collapsing, the walls rotting, nature reclaiming what had been briefly carved out of the wilderness. Local teenagers would dare each other to approach it at night, telling ghost stories about the murdered men whose spirits supposedly still lingered there. But mostly it was forgotten, just another abandoned structure in the mountains holding its secrets. The case had raised uncomfortable questions that the community struggled to answer. How much abuse should a person endure before violent resistance becomes justified? What responsibility did neighbors and community members have to intervene when they suspected someone was being hurt? Where was the line between a father's authority over his household and criminal behavior? These weren't questions with easy answers, and in 1949, most people weren't ready to confront them head-on. The idea that a father's absolute authority over his family might need limits was radical, threatening to the established order. The notion that a daughter might have the right to refuse a marriage her father had arranged challenged assumptions that ran deep in the culture. The legal system had done its best to navigate between competing demands for justice and mercy. The manslaughter verdict and the relatively moderate sentence represented an acknowledgement that Sarah's actions, while wrong, had emerged from extreme circumstances. But it also maintained that taking human life came with consequences, that personal suffering didn't grant unlimited permission to harm others. What the case revealed most starkly was the vulnerability of those without power or resources. Sarah had been trapped not just by her father's violence, but by poverty, isolation, and a lack of options. In a different context, with money and connections, her situation might have been resolved without violence. She might have been able to leave to seek help to find protection. But for a poor girl in the rural in 1949, those options simply didn't exist. The story also highlighted the randomness of tragedy, the way one person's choices could destroy multiple lives in an instant. Moss had died simply because he'd agreed to meet a girl he might marry. His children had lost their father, not through any fault of his own, but because he'd been in the wrong place at precisely the wrong moment. That kind of senseless loss was perhaps the hardest thing for people to accept, the idea that life could be snuffed out so arbitrarily. In the years that followed, the Henderson case would occasionally be remembered when similar situations arose. People would reference it in discussions about domestic violence, about the limits of parental authority, about the desperation that poverty could create. It became a kind of cautionary tale, though different people drew different lessons from it. Some saw it as a warning about what happened when fathers ruled their households with violence and cruelty. Others saw it as evidence of what occurred when children were allowed to defy authority. Still others viewed it as a tragic illustration of how poverty and isolation could destroy families from the inside out. The truth, as is often the case, was more complicated than any single interpretation could capture. The Henderson case was about power and powerlessness, about the ways people respond when pushed to their limits, about the terrible consequences that can flow from systems that trap people in impossible situations. It was about individual choices made in moments of crisis, but also about societal structures that created the conditions where such crises could occur. Sarah Henderson, in her prison cell and later in her small apartment in Texas, would spend the rest of her life thinking about those few seconds on January 18, 1949. The feeling of the gun in her hand, heavy and cold, the deafening crack of it firing. The way time had seemed to slow down as she'd watched the consequences of her actions unfold. She'd gotten what she'd wanted in some sense. She was free of her father, free of the forced marriage. But the price had been higher than she could ever have imagined. In the end, the Macabre cabin in the woods became more than just a crime scene. It became a symbol of all the hidden suffering that existed in places most people never saw, of the violence that festered in homes where outsiders rarely ventured. It stood as a reminder that the quiet mountains held stories that were anything but peaceful, that behind closed doors throughout the region, similar dramas of desperation and violence were likely playing out even as people tried to forget what had happened to the Henderson family. Justice, such as it was, had been served. But justice couldn't undo what had been done, couldn't bring back the dead, couldn't restore the innocence of those who'd witnessed and participated in the tragedy. It could only draw a line under the events and declare them concluded, allowing everyone to move forward carrying whatever they'd learned from the experience. And in the year of 1949, moving forward often meant moving on in silence, keeping painful memories locked away where they couldn't disturb the surface calm of daily life. The Henderson case would fade from public discussion, but it would never truly disappear, living on in the private recollections of those who'd been touched by it, a dark thread woven permanently into the fabric of the community's history.